before we begin recounting the events of the following war. If you're someone who enjoys history and the stories of soldiers and battles that changed the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the events we cover here. And share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever served in the military, or do you wish you could experience what it's like to serve? Your opinions mean a lot to us and help us build a true community of history enthusiasts. The night the sky went white with snow, Joachim Rønneberg stood on the edge of a small airfield in Scotland and tried not to think of the house he would probably never see again. Norway's fjords were his home. The war had stolen them, but it had not yet taken his stubbornness. At 23, he was neither a legend nor a politician, just a young radio operator, a hunter of quiet things, chosen because he could move in silence and think inside cold. By the winter of 1943, the Germans' appetite for secrets had become a problem for everyone who could still imagine a world after the war. Far up in the mountainous valley of Rjukan, where a black river cut through cliffs and the autumn sun barely pierced the gorge, a tall industrial plant hummed with a terrifying rhythm. Inside its concrete belly, machines churned out heavy water, liquid with a heavier isotope of hydrogen, a substance the British intelligence chiefs feared might feed the beginnings of a German atomic program. The maps called the place Vemork. The word became, among a handful of men, a metonym for the end of everything. The plan to stop it did not begin with high command. It began in a training camp whose huts smelled of wood smoke and wet uniforms, where operatives from occupied Europe learned to climb, to shoot, to fold themselves into the dark. Rønneberg was picked for one of those small, almost ridiculous teams, 6 Norwegians, a handful of explosives, radios that answered only when handled like secrets. They were part of Compagnie Linge, the Norwegian arm of Britain's Special Operations Executive, made to disappear into enemy territory and break things that could not be unbroken. If that sounds simple, it is because history simplifies heroism into clean lines. In practice, there were misfires, dropped supplies that landed in the wrong valley, frost that turned a man's fingers to useless blocks, and voices on the radio that were cut off mid-sentence. There was also a reconnaissance party, 4 men nicknamed Grouse, who had already been dropped into the plateau above Rjukan months earlier. They sent back a message that the plant was more guarded than imagined. Sentries walked at night, searchlights crossed like a fisherman's net, and the road itself was a knife of ice. The Grouse men survived by eating from the land and keeping their stories to themselves. Their presence gave the planners one impossible and terrifying gift: confirmation that a raid was feasible, and that feasibility was razor-thin. Rønneberg and his 6 were prepared for one impossible night: to climb a steep ravine, cross a frozen river, walk past sentries, and set explosives inside a fortress of pipes and concrete without being seen. The training taught them how to tie a knot with numb fingers, how to camouflage bootprints that wished to shout, how to move not like men but like shadows pulled along by purpose. When the blackout over Britain deepened and the aircraft engines were a far-off rumble in the hills, Rønneberg loaded his pack and fastened the little brass compass he had kept since childhood. He had been given maps with lines drawn in pencil and a single order: make the plant unusable. There was, quietly, another order from the older officers who had watched him stumble and then focus during simulations: don't come back if it's not necessary. The word sat in his throat like a stone. The night they flew north, the snow below was a rolled sheet of bone. Men unhooked their parachutes and said nothing. Intelligence had guessed at how the Germans would react. None of them had guessed about the trait that would save them: stubborn, small-team cunning mixed with a willingness to accept absolute risk. As the aircraft doors opened and the cold began to suck at their breath, Rønneberg felt the shape of the coming hours hinge inside him like a trapdoor. There would be no glorious charge, no drums, only the quiet, surgical violence of men who would rather be ghosts than heroes. At the edge of the southern horizon, Norway waited, a country half hidden beneath snow, half hidden beneath occupation, and holding at its center a machine that everyone feared. Rønneberg fell into the dark. The parachutes blossomed black against the moonlit snow, barely visible even to the men falling beneath them. Rønneberg hit the ground hard, rolling through a drift that swallowed him up to the chest. For a moment he lay still, listening not for Germans, but for the telltale hiss of a torn canopy or the choking gasp of a teammate injured on landing. Nothing. Just the windy rasp of the Hardangervidda Plateau, a wilderness so massive it felt less like land and more like a creature breathing. They gathered quickly, 6 silhouettes hunched against the white. The temperature had sunk so low that words left their mouths as tiny crystals. Rønneberg counted his men, each a moving blot of frost, and nodded once. No speeches, no comfort. Their mission had begun with a fall into silence, and silence would remain their only shield. The plan seemed straightforward on paper. Travel east across the plateau, link up with the grouse team, prepare for the assault on Vemork. But the Hardangervidda had a way of reinventing difficulty. Snowdrifts hid crevices like hungry mouths, winds came in violent pulses, and visibility shrank without warning. More than once they had to backtrack after losing all sense of direction, even with compasses trembling in their hands. On the third night, the blizzard came. There was no warning, first wind, then white. A tidal wave of snow rolled across the plateau, a living wall that erased the world. They wrapped canvas around their faces, crouched low, and pushed against gusts strong enough to topple a reindeer. At one point, Rønneberg felt one of his men grip his sleeve and hold on, not out of fear, but to prove they still existed. The storm turned them into pale shadows crawling across an endless sheet of paper. Food became a calculation, exhaustion a negotiation. They ate rationed chocolate, scraped snow into their mouths for water, and slept in a dugout they carved with shaking hands. More than once, doubt crept between the folds of their determination. If they froze or starved here, far from the plant they'd sworn to destroy, the world might never learn their names. Only that the German nuclear program had grown one step closer to unthinkable success. On the 7th day, just as the wind eased into something almost gentle, a sound cut through the air, 2 short whistles, one long. The prearranged signal. The grouse team had found them. 4 gaunt men stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders, their beards iced, their faces thin from months of surviving off snow, moss, and whatever could be coaxed from the land. They looked like ghosts carved from the mountain itself. Yet their eyes burned with a fierce intelligence, men who had watched the enemy move across their homeland, who knew the patterns of patrols, the weaknesses of the terrain, and the fragile heartbeat of the Vemork plant. The reunion wasn't emotional, it was urgent. They shook hands like men exchanging time-sensitive secrets. The grouse leader handed Rønneberg a weathered notebook filled with diagrams of the plant, guard rotations, access tunnels, the narrow suspension bridge that hung over a 200-meter gorge like a thread of doom. "You try the bridge," he warned, "and you'll be seen, or you'll never reach the other side in this wind." Rønneberg closed the notebook slowly, his breath turning to fog between them. "Then we don't use the bridge." The grouse men exchanged puzzled glances. There was no other route, not one any sane soldier would attempt. Which, of course, meant nothing to the kind of men who had been sent here. As night settled over the plateau, the combined team crouched around a dim, carefully shielded flame, tracing lines in the snow with gloved fingers. To reach the plant unseen, they would have to descend into the ravine below it, a near-vertical drop of ice and rock, cross the raging river at its base, and climb up the opposite side into the industrial labyrinth without alerting a single guard. It was madness. It was also their best chance. And as the flame flickered between them, Rønneberg felt it, that quiet, electrifying recognition that the world sometimes hinges on impossible choices made by men who refuse to look away. The real mission was about to begin. The gorge beneath Vemork looked, in daylight, like something carved by an angry god. But under nightfall, with the moon veiled behind thick cloud, it became worse, a void, a black scar splitting the mountain. Wind hissed through it like a warning whispered straight into the bones. Rønneberg lay flat on his stomach at the edge of the drop, peering down. The dim outline of the hydroelectric plant loomed across the ravine, floodlights sweeping the snow, guards packing the steel walkways, the hum of machines echoing through the frozen void. Between him and that fortress was a descent so steep it bordered on suicidal. Perfect. No one would expect intruders from the impossible side. He signaled the team with a gloved hand, and one by one they began the crawl downward. There was no path, only patches of ice, jagged outcrops, and the occasional stunted shrub anchored stubbornly to rock. Their crampons bit into the ice with small, careful clicks that sounded far too loud in a place where silence was their only weapon. Halfway down, the wind shifted, blowing upward from the gorge like the exhale of a buried giant. Snow swirled around them. One slip here meant vanishing into the roar of the river, a fall no one could survive. Rønneberg planted his axe, muscles trembling under the tension. Men didn't speak. They communicated with taps, gestures, the subtle exchange of trust. At the base, the river was worse than the descent. A ribbon of black water slicing through the ice, fast enough to tear a man from the world in seconds. And yet, beneath the plant's powerhouse, there was a narrow crossing, a frozen ledge that had been intentionally left unguarded because anyone crossing it would have to be insane. Which by this point all of them were. They moved in single file, boots slipped, gloves tightened, breaths turned shallow. The sound of rushing water rose to a deafening hiss. Once one of the men lost footing and slammed against Rønneberg's back. He locked his stance, anchoring them both, teeth gritted so hard the pressure rang in his skull. They pressed on. When they reached the far side, they collapsed into the shelter of a rocky overhang, chests heaving. The plant loomed above them now, impossibly close. A towering beast of pipes and concrete crouched atop the mountainside. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly through the storm, and the smell of industrial chemicals hung in the air. "Root in," whispered one of the grouse men, pointing to a narrow drainage tunnel hidden beneath a platform of frozen pipes. It was barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through, but it led directly beneath the heavy water production chamber. Rønneberg wiped frost from his eyelashes. "Good, we move." As they approached the tunnel, the unexpected happened. One of the plant's guard dogs, a massive German shepherd, emerged from the shadows above them, its silhouette sharp against the snow. It froze, ears pricking toward the ravine. A low growl rumbled from its chest. The men tensed, hands drifting toward their knives. If the dog barked even once, every guard in Vemork would converge on their position within minutes. The dog stepped forward. Rønneberg's pulse hammered. Wind, snow, silence. Then, a crack of ice snapped somewhere on the opposite side of the ravine, carried by the wind. The dog jerked its head toward the sound, barked twice, and sprinted away from them, chasing a phantom echo into the darkness. For a second, nobody breathed. The mountain had chosen to lie for them, just this once. Rønneberg didn't waste the gift. Inside now. One by one, freezing, exhausted, dripping with meltwater from the river, the team slid into the narrow tunnel beneath Vemork, swallowed by darkness. Above them, behind thick walls, the heavy water cells hummed, the heart of the German nuclear dream. And they were now inside its ribcage. The tunnel swallowed them whole. Cold metal scraped their packs. Water dripped in slow, mocking rhythms. Every few meters, Rønneberg had to stop and wait for the next man's boots to shift behind him, the only proof that the team hadn't vanished into the black. When they finally crawled out into the maintenance corridor beneath the plant, they looked like creatures clawed out of the mountain itself, soaked, shivering, covered in grit. Overhead, pipes snaked in all directions, steaming faintly. The air was hot, shockingly hot compared to the frost outside. That meant they were close. Very close. Rønneberg signaled the men forward. The corridor angled left, then right, navigating like the intestines of some industrial beast. Above them, the muffled stomp of German boots echoed from the upper floors, guards changing posts, checking gauges, unaware that 7 ghosts moved beneath their feet. And then they reached it. The heavy water production chamber. A narrow steel staircase led up to a small room lined with cylinders, long, gleaming containers filled with deuterium-rich water. The Germans considered this place untouchable, protected by cliffs, bridges, patrols, and the sheer arrogance of engineering. Rønneberg tested the door. Unlocked. The most heavily defended secret in occupied Norway, left unlatched. Later, historians would shake their heads at this detail. But in that moment, standing in the humid glow of pipes and valves, Rønneberg felt something else. The strange calm that comes when fate tips its hand. They slipped inside. The chamber hummed, a mechanical heartbeat. Sweat formed instantly on their cold skin. The machines radiated heat, making the place feel like a boiler room in hell. Rows of electrolysis cells gurgled gently, unaware that their days and perhaps Germany's atomic ambitions were numbered. Rønneberg and his second-in-command, Knut Haukelid, moved straight to the critical cylinders, checking the labels hand-copied from intelligence reports. "This one," Haukelid whispered. They unpacked the explosives, small charges British-made, each no bigger than a loaf of bread but designed to cripple machinery with surgical precision. No dramatic fireball, no collapsing building, just a quiet, devastating stop. Rønneberg knelt, wiring the fuses with steady hands. He tried not to think of the absurdity. Months of training, a lethal descent, a freezing gorge, all funneled into this single minute of fragile concentration. Behind him, the rest of the team held position, weapons raised toward the doorway. Every second without a guard barging in felt like borrowed time. Haukelid checked his watch. "Set. 5 seconds delay," Rønneberg whispered. "Enough to get us clear, barely." He clipped the final wire into place. The machine hissed. A footstep sounded overhead. Everyone froze. More footsteps, packing, pausing, turning. A guard performing his nightly rounds directly above the chamber. If he descended those stairs, if he opened the door, if he saw even one of them. Rønneberg pressed himself against the machine, heart hammering. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cold. A metallic clang echoed, a fallen tool somewhere deeper in the plant. The guard stopped, listened, and walked the opposite way. The team did not breathe until his steps faded completely. Rønneberg exhaled slowly, whispering, "We're done here." They filed out, silent and swift, leaving behind neat rows of humming cylinders with a new secret ticking quietly inside them. As they descended back into the maintenance corridor, Haukelid gave Rønneberg a single look, tired, knowing, almost reverent. The charges were set. The heart of the German nuclear effort was about to stop beating. Now came the dangerous part. Getting out alive. They ran. Not in chaos, not in panic, but in that disciplined, silent sprint only men who expect death at any second can master. The maintenance tunnel swallowed them again, forcing them to crawl, then crouch, then slide on elbows through the dark. Behind them, Rønneberg pictured the explosives ticking down in the belly of the plant. 5 seconds was nothing. A heartbeat, a breath. When they emerged back into the ravine, the wind sliced across their faces with merciless cold. Snow whipped sideways. The team regrouped under the rocky overhang where they had waited earlier. No words, just haggard nods. And then, a low, metallic groan rippled up the mountainside. The men flattened instinctively. A sharp, muffled thump followed. Then another. A chain of dull explosions rolled through the plant like thunder, trapped inside steel lungs. The lights atop Vemork flickered once, twice, and died. For a moment, The entire mountainside went black. Then the alarms erupted, shrill, panicked, discordant. Guards shouted in German, running across catwalks. Searchlights sputtered to life and swung wildly over the ravine, probing the night like shaking fingers. Rønneberg felt a pulse of satisfaction. Not triumph, not joy, just a grim, exhausted confirmation. They had done it. The heavy water cells were destroyed. But the mountain and the Germans were now awake. "Move," he hissed. They scrambled back across the frozen ledge, boots sliding, hands gripping the rock until their knuckles burned. The river roared louder now, as if mocking their exhaustion. Snow stung their eyes. Once, a searchlight swept so close above them that the heat of it warmed their faces. A single misstep here meant death. A single sound meant capture. Capture meant torture, and the end of everything they had just achieved. Halfway across, one of the men slipped. His crampon skidded off the ice. He pitched forward, arms flailing. Rønneberg lunged, grabbing the strap of the man's pack with both hands. The jolt nearly tore his shoulder out of its socket, but he held. They pressed together against the gorge wall, breathing hard. Above them, 2 German guards pointed rifles down into the ravine, squinting at the shadows. Snow falling off the cliff above disguised their movement. The guards cursed, lost interest, and moved on. The mountain lied for them again. Once they reached the opposite side, the climb up the ravine felt endless. Muscles shook, lungs burned. Every second the Germans grew more frantic, firing flares that washed the snow in eerie red light. But the plateau, that vast, frozen shield, waited above them like a promise. And finally, after 20 nightmarish minutes of climbing, crawling, and scrambling, they reached it. The world opened into white silence again. Far behind them, Vemork burned with alarm lights and furious shouts, a beast wounded and flailing. Rønneberg waved the men forward. Now came the final miracle. They had to vanish into a landscape that could kill them faster than any soldier. For 2 days they skied across the Hardingervidda, pushing into storms that erased their tracks before the Germans could follow. They lived on crumbs, snowmelt, and the sheer will not to die before delivering the news. And then, on a calm, fragile dawn, the wind eased. The clouds parted. A British extraction team appeared on the horizon. Rønneberg stood in the snow, exhausted to the marrow, watching the approaching silhouettes. His pack was lighter. His legs barely held him. But the mission, the impossible mission, was done. Later, the world would learn what the raid had prevented. A delay so devastating to Germany's nuclear ambitions that the war's outcome shifted forever. Historians would call it one of the most brilliant sabotage operations in history. But at that moment, as the rescuers reached him, Joachim Rønneberg simply closed his eyes and whispered, "We made it." A young man, nearly frozen, standing on the edge of a white world, having changed the course of it forever.